Good morning, everyone. Good to see you all. Good to be with you once again. It's a beautiful day outside. Really going to be a lovely weekend, I think. It's been a nice ending to the week, so it's always very pleasant. Um, I've got my Dharma talk prepared today, but I know several people remarked on my wagesa this morning, saying they looked very nice. Appreciate that. It's my rainbow wagesa. This is June, so it's Pride Month, so I thought I'd wear this. The Toronto Buddhist Church is going to be marching in the Toronto Pride Parade at the end of the month on Sunday. I think that's the 29th. Maybe I'm right, maybe I'm wrong. I might have that wrong. Let me think about that. Um, okay. Anyways, it's that last weekend, that last Sunday. We'll be doing that, and so I'll wear my rainbow wages at that time. We also have a table at the Pride Street Fair. We did this last year, and it was really a wonderful experience, and glad that we had that opportunity. I'm not sure whether we have the manpower in Hamilton to be able to do that with the Hamilton Pride, but if people ever wanted to organize something like that, just be in touch and I can help talk you through it. I'm not sure, though, that we're quite as spry a group that's up for marching all around all afternoon long. So we may have to just wish everyone well in that case. Bless you. So my actual talk this morning, though, is not about Pride or Father's Day or anything else that's going on right now. Rather, I'm reaching back into my own personal recent past. You may recall last month during the Dharma talk, I talked about my rafting trip to the Yukon and Alaska. Actually, I didn't actually talk about the rafting part. I talked about the shower in the hotel room before I even got to the river. So I was like, well, you know, hopefully that was okay, but like it's also kind of a lame talk because I didn't actually get to the main part of what the experience was. So I thought I'd maybe talk a little bit about some of the lessons that I derived from that actual rafting trip, which was quite an interesting experience for me and for my family last August, I suppose it was. So, you know, we were on a series of these rubber rafts, and you come down the river. And towards the end of the trip, but still with several days left, we floated out of Canada and into Alaska across the border. I guess at that time, Donald Trump wasn't yet in the White House, so we could just flow across, you know, and there wasn't any problems. These days, it's quite a bit more difficult to get across the border for some folks. But we just flowed right into Alsac Lake there in Alaska. This was really an amazing place because this is a large glacial lake. So it's formed by the melting of the glaciers on the mountains that forms this beautiful lake. And then there are icebergs floating in the lake. We often think of icebergs as being in the ocean, but these are in this large glacial lake because they had calved off of the off of the glaciers, right? And then they would float around, and eventually they would make their way out of the lake and into the river, and then out to the ocean, and then be in the Pacific at that point. So there at the lake, I really enjoyed watching those icebergs floating around, and all around us there were tall mountains. Some of those mountains were green with short alder trees that grow there. Some of them were jagged with white snowpacks on top. And between those mountains, there would be these mighty glaciers, which were colored blue and white. And they also had some brown portions from dirt and rock that were on them. And in the distance there at Alsac Lake rose up Mount Fairweather, which is called that because it's this dazzling white peak, but you can only see it. It's only visible when the weather is clear. Only when you have fair weather can you see it. Otherwise, it's often obscured fully or in part. So, you know, I'm looking at all this and I'm thinking about how some people imagine that the Dharma, the Buddhist teaching, is some sort of abstract principle that's above or separate from the regular world. But this really isn't so. Rather, the Dharma, this is a set of basic truths that manifest as the natural workings of our lives and the natural workings of the world of which we're a part of. This is why we sometimes describe some of the aspects of Dharma as like laws of nature in a way, because they're just sort of embedded in reality as it is. And that's very apparent in a place like Alaska, where everywhere you turn, there's bodhisattvas of the world that are preaching the Dharma. So what do I mean by this? Well, for example, when I looked up at Mount Fairweather, sometimes I could see all the way to the peak. And sometimes the entire mountain was lost in the clouds there. And Alaska is amply teaching us always the truth of impermanence, one of the fundamental aspects of the Dharma, because the environment there is always changing. I didn't know this before I went there, but it was always changing when we were there. At one moment, it would be cloudy and it would be cold, even in the middle of the day, even in August. This is the warmest it gets. It could be quite cloudy and cold there. But then a little while later, the winds would blow those clouds away temporarily and would become clear and sunny. And then you'd have to take your coat off because you'd be way too hot at that point. You'd be overheated. So this is actually dukkha. This is the suffering that comes from the misalignment between how conditions are and how we are, or how we want things to be. This is a common part of the Dharma. So then, things will change again. Great, you took off your coat, but soon enough it's windy, but still clear, but you're gonna need your coat again, and your hat, has to go on. But then the wind dies down, and now your hat's a problem, so you take it off. But with the wind gone, then these Alaskan mosquitoes and black flies and no-see-ums, they just come out of I don't know where, like they just manifest seemingly suddenly all around you. And they're voraciously annoying, and they're coming to torment you, at least from your perspective. I'm sure from their perspective, they're like, oh, good, finally, dinner got delivered to us here on the tundra. But, for me, I was like, oh, this is terrible. Like you take off your hat, your coat, you're like, oh, it's so beautiful. And then, they're right on you in this way. So you have to put on more layers, and more likely you just give up and you retreat into your tent. But soon enough, you get too hot inside these thermal tents, right? And frankly, the outside views are so superior, especially to looking at the inside of your tent, that eventually you're going to pop back out again, and you're going to face whatever it is that Alaska is doing now at that moment, right? So it's really never-ending change. And each change, it brings relief, but it also brings suffering. So, also as the weather is showing in these situations, everything is very intimately connected. So loss of wind brings bugs. Loss of clouds brings sunburn. People were getting sunburned in Alaska, right, on this trip. Loss of the sun, it brings cold. So there's all these connections between the things. Because one thing would happen, some other condition would arise. Everything was interconnected with everything else. This was always very, very apparent from moment to moment in this wild environment. And at the same time, we have to say that Alsake Lake that I described, it's there because of the glaciers, which are melting and producing the icebergs that are drifting around in these very interesting shapes. And the glaciers, they made the mountains into the shapes they are today. These glaciers are so enormous and so heavy that they scraped away the rock and they changed the shape of these mountains. But at the same time, the mountains make the glaciers because they create the conditions for the precipitation that becomes the glaciers. And of course, water as it only fills in the shape of what is already there. So the mountains and the glaciers are co-creating each other all the time. And they're always changing. Even these glaciers, you look at them, they're like, oh, there's a glacier. It's actually moving. These glaciers kind of walking across the landscape just at such a slow pace that we, frenetic humans, don't really perceive it. But the scientists studying these things can say, oh, yes, they're actually constantly moving, constantly reshaping and being reshaped as in the landscape there. And the mountains there, they provide the foundation and the nutrition for these trees, these alder trees that grow on it. And at the same time, then the trees hold the mountain soil in place, which slows down the process of erosion and the loss of the mountains. So all these things are completely interconnected. And so it's all very apparent when you're actually in this sort of space. And interdependence, this is a core teaching of the Buddha. Alaska is always demonstrating this core teaching of the Buddha to you. And unless you're an accomplished wilderness survivor, which I am not, I know you probably look at me and think, oh, he's like Bear Grylls, or Survivor Man or somebody, I'd be able to do it. No, actually, I'll have to admit, I'm not an accomplished survivalist. So if then the only food and the only shelter that you have are those that you bring with you. And these, even that's very heavily restricted by not only law, but also the limits and practicalities. The small planes that you take to get out to the river, and then the even smaller river rafts that you're actually traveling on. So you have to be very smart, very intentional about everything you bring out there. And there's no electronics, there's no outside communications, there's no facilities. You have to pee in the river and poop in a can, and you have to burn your trash or carry it away with you across these miles and miles of, water and rocky terrain, everything. So all of this really reduces your possibilities in these situations. And they force you to become directly mindful of every decision and of every moment's situation. You don't really have a choice. The situation, the circumstances force you into this awareness and this attention at all times. If you drop your awareness, that's going to lead to disaster, whether by bear, or a lot of bears out there, or by cold, or by hunger, or by accident. There's many, many risks. If you don't maintain your mindfulness, your awareness at all time, Alaska's gonna bite you, and maybe literally, and force you back into attention. At the same time, you become more in tune with your environment, moment by moment and day after day. And as this is happening, I found that we all start to feel more and more alive, actually, by becoming more in tune, even with this potentially harsh or unforgiving but very beautiful environment. We felt much more alive, much more relaxed, much freer, actually, than the usual problems that we have. Just focusing on these moment by moment problems, the bugs, the cold, the sunburn, the other thing, like actually made life much more joyful, honestly, more satisfying in these ways because of that mindful attention to the moment as it was unfolding. In the controlled environment of the cities that we live in, or for that matter, in the monasteries where Buddhist monks practice, in both of those sort of controlled situations, mindfulness actually can become an artificial exercise. You induce mindfulness by sitting still and cutting out distractions until you notice your mental operations and can kind of track the way your mind is working and everything. But out there in the wild, I found mindfulness is actually just simply living. Because when you become too unmindful, you're quickly reminded to come back to your attention, or else in these situations. There's something wonderful about being in the outdoors, I find, especially in the full wilderness. It's not a coincidence that I'm doing a graduate degree in environmental studies at this time, right? But it's not more true, to be clear, that like the Dharma is more true in the woods than it is in the city, or that there's more suffering or less suffering in either of these situations. That's not what I'm trying to suggest. The difference isn't really with the environment. The difference is with us and how we are in these different places. The Buddha is always working to wake us up, whether in the city or in the wilderness. But here in our sort of ordinary civilized lives, we've elaborated such a thick weave of self that's harder for us to let the Buddha's light in these ways. We wrap ourselves ever deeper in the trappings of so-called self, of identity, of creature comforts, until we become sort of practically mummies of our creation, it seems like to me. But out there in the wild, most of those layers of the sort of diluted self or the artificial self, these get stripped away. And then the sunlight of Amida Buddha's working is able to shine on us much more directly. So while it's available in all cases, we tend to create lives that close us off in a way from the Dharma, whereas out in the wild, we don't have that ability to manipulate things in that way. And in some ways, actually, this brings us more in touch with simple reality as it is. Then that sort of hidden peak of our Mount Fairweather, so to speak, becomes more easily revealed in that sort of situation. Even when we don't see it, even in the distracting bustle of our everyday life, this is still here. You know, the peak of Mount Fairweather is always there behind the clouds, whether or not we see it, right? And when the fair weather, the winds blow away the clouds, we can perceive what was always there. Is the true with it's true also of the Dharma and of our sort of more genuine selves, always present even in the bustle of the city. But until the Dharma sort of blows away the obscurations, our attachments, our greeds, our false senses of self, we don't really perceive these deeper truths. And I learned a lot by watching the mountains and watching the glaciers, but it was the icebergs that were really my favorite, and my favorite sort of Dharma teachers there in the wild. You know, watching them, I remembered, or in some cases learned a lot about the Dharma, which of course is to say about myself. And these icebergs, they're many different shapes, many different sizes. They look very impressive. They're very interesting. And they're often beautiful as they float in this dazzling, sort of pure blue lake, glacial lake there. But as we all know, the part of the iceberg that you can see above the surface, that's only about 20% of the actual berg, right? I think we all learned this in school. Like you can see a little bit of the iceberg, but most of the iceberg is below the water, below the surface. Most of it is concealed from us down there below the water. It's a threat. We can't perceive its shape. It has dangerous ridges that you can't discern, right? Even though intellectually we know that there's more, we know there's a danger there, but we can't actually directly perceive it ourselves in this way. And like that iceberg, that's also how we are ourselves. No matter how hard we practice Buddhism or work at therapy or reflect on ourselves or any of the other sort of methods that we use to try to understand ourselves, we make some progress, but most of our deeper attachments, our sort of deepest ignorance, our foolishness remains not only hidden, but actually just simply unseeable to us. This is sort of the stark truth of our self-powered attempts at awakening. Even the most accomplished meditator, they can't see the back of their own head. They can't perceive the full depth of their basic human attachment. This doesn't mean that their efforts are in vain, only that they're always incomplete, always incomplete. The majority of the iceberg is always below the waterline. That's simply how things are. But also watching the icebergs, I noticed some other things. For one thing, the icebergs are not static. Like everything else, they're subject to constant change. Not only do they move, you know, they float about and they melt. Sometimes they would dramatically roll over. This was really amazing when this would happen. It was very dramatic. It'd be a loud rumbling that you could hear throughout these sort of miles of water and wilderness, and waves would be thrown up on the shore when this happened, because these things are gigantic, some of these icebergs. When they roll, this is a major event. In fact, we had to be careful about not setting our tents too close to the edge of the lake, because small iceberg-caused tsunamis could rush up and sweep you out into that frigid lake. And especially in the middle of the night when you're asleep, zipped up in your tent, you don't want to suddenly find that your tent is in the middle of the lake and you're sinking. That's really not what you came to Alaska to do. So you have to be very careful about these things. These icebergs, the reason they roll is because of the warming effects of the sun and of the water. The heat of the water that's trapped in heat of the sun that's trapped in the water there. And when they roll, they suddenly reveal a portion of their hidden underside, of course. So they thrust into the light aspects of themselves that had been there all along, and they were affecting the course of the iceberg and affecting things around it, but they were obscured and mysterious, so we couldn't really perceive them in this way. Why am I talking so much about icebergs? Because in my mind, as I sat there, this is what I was thinking. These are from my notes when I was sitting there looking at all this. This is like awakening in Buddhism, like Shinji. So worked on by the brilliance of the Buddha's infinite light of wisdom, we are illuminated and we suddenly become aware of some of our deep Bombu nature. And this process is sort of exciting and educational, as sort of a spiritual thrill. You wake up to aspects of yourself and aspects of reality in this way. This is very important, very valuable. But as I watched the icebergs rolling, something else occurred to me as well. When they roll, they reveal a portion of their hidden selves, but they don't reveal the fullness of their deep secrets. And as hidden aspects are thrust out into view as it rolls, parts that we could previously see that were up in the air, then they're plunged into the water and they disappear from view. So while we become aware of aspects of ourselves and our lives that are important to wake up to, the very act of noticing those things pulls our attention away from other things that we did perceive previously. We have a finite capacity for awareness, for self-knowledge, and for mindfulness. These are all very important, but we as people do have finite capacities. So humility is really necessary as we practice Buddhism, so that we don't mistake the rolling of the iceberg's underside into the open air as actual perception of the total iceberg. That's impossible as long as the iceberg remains an iceberg, because things are always under the surface. In case I'm being too obtuse here, to be clear, I'm not actually talking about icebergs. This is ourselves and how we operate. There's really only one way that the ice can be truly, fully liberated. And Shinran describes this process. He actually specifically talks about ice in his writings. He says that the ice of blind passions becomes the water of awakening. This is a metaphor that he actually resorts to numerous times in his writings. And this happens as the Buddha's natural working brings us to Buddhahood just as we are. Even though we are icebergs with limited capacities and much that is hidden from us, no matter how we try to perceive it, nonetheless, as the Dharma works on us, we do eventually discover the melting of the ice and merging with the water of awakening. So this is a process that goes on throughout our lives, and in the Jodo Shinshu teaching is completed at the moment of death, as the ice of our blind karmic entanglements is melted by the full light of the Buddha's compassionate wisdom. And we sort of complete that process, becoming part of the waters of awakening. Because of this, to slightly paraphrase Shinran, we can say the larger the iceberg, the more refreshing Dharma water is produced at the end of the process. He just said, the more the ice, the more the water, but same difference with icebergs. So there's many more lessons that those pure waters and sky and trees and land of Alaska teach to people who go there and visit with them. But I'll just mention one more. Don't worry, we're coming to the very end here. Chief among the many other lessons, I discovered that when every moment requires your close mindfulness and you're reduced to the basic facts of living in a beautiful and dangerous world, then gratitude is always bubbling forth in that situation. This is what I really found. So you're cold beneath like 4 layers of clothes, but gratitude springs out as soon as you receive a mug of hot cocoa or coffee or something like this. And you're tormented by blood-sucking insects, but thankfulness swells with every good gust of wind that offers you some relief. Just right away, as soon as you receive a little relief, you immediately feel a rush of thankfulness in this way. And you're hungry after pulling on the oars of the raft all day. So, when this happens, it's really easy actually to bow your head and to say, itadakimasu. When you get just like a simple sandwich or just some rice and vegetables, stuff that like you would not go out of your way to eat at home, or if you're at the restaurant in civilization, you wouldn't order it off the menu. But now receive it in this situation, it's like, the proverbial manna from heaven or something like this, right? You're so thankful. Immediately you want to say itadakimasu as soon as you receive just some basic food in this way. In the wilderness, there's so many fewer conveniences that every small comfort is recognized for the gift that it is. Actually, we're continually receiving gifts all the time here in our civilized lives, but because we are used to them and take them for granted, we don't respond with simple gratitude to everything. We actually ignore them as gifts and take them as just sort of natural rights or something in this way. But in the wilderness, suddenly those small things become greatly magnified, and you realize the value that they had all along. So it was very natural for me to put my hands together and to say Namo Amida Butsu each night as I was laying down in my sleeping bag. So I really felt this way. So to conclude, you survived Alaska and my Dharma talk. These are the lessons that I wanted to share from Alaska, aspects of impermanence, of interdependence, of gradual awakening to ourselves, and especially of gratitude. Thank you very much for listening this morning to my talk.